Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Good to be back with you. Everyone hit the like button as you come on. We have an incredible show for you today because the mask is off and the jig is up. The peace president, Donald Trump, has put the nail in the coffin of any illusions that the U.S. would scale back its wars. From threats to Vladimir Putin, more weapons coming to Ukraine in that failed proxy war, to the endless buildup toward war in West Asia to topple Iran and the massive military drills against China that have just come underway, a blazing warpath has been ignited that simply won't be arrested. And it's already backfiring in critical ways. Now, to discuss all the geopolitical repercussions, I have good friends of the show with me tonight. First is Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. Welcome, Brian. It's good to be back with you tonight.
Thank you so much for having me back, and I'm quite honored to be on this panel discussion.
Yes, it's going to be a great one. And then we have Carl Zha. He is host of Silk and Steel podcast. Carl, good to see you. All right. Oh, you're muted. It's fine. It's fine. All right, and then we have.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Then we have KJ Noh. He is host of the China Report on Breakthrough News. KJ, good to see you.
Great to be with you.
Yes. Well, how about we talk about this first, gentlemen? Let's talk about this leaked audio that has come from a supposedly a campaign fundraiser. A lot of people are casting doubt on this because of the source, CNN. But in it, Donald Trump had very choice words for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the presidents of Russia and China. Here is what he said.
Well, tonight we're learning those details as the audio reveals that Trump says that he threatened not just President Putin, but also China's President Xi Jinping. And this is what he told donors about what exactly that conversation looked like during a private fundraiser last year.
To Putin, I said, if you go in to Ukraine, we're going to bomb the shit out of Moscow. I'm telling you, I have no choice. Republic wants it. Republic. So he goes like, I don't believe you. He said, no way. And I said, way. And then he goes like, I don't believe you. But the truth is, he believed me 10%. I told you this. He believed me 10%. Then I'm with President Xi of China. But I said the same thing to them. I said, you know, if you go into Taiwan, I'm going to bomb the shit out of Beijing. He thought I was crazy. He said, Beijing? You're going to bomb Beijing? I said, I have no choice. I got to bomb them. We're going to bomb Beijing. And he didn't believe me either, except 10%. And 10% is all you did. In fact,
so that's about the gist of it, that he would bomb the SHIT out of both Russia and China should they engage in war activities that he didn't like. But then over the course of the last recent period, gentlemen, he's been having choice words with Vladimir Putin, especially as things ramp up in Ukraine. This is what he had to say about Putin recently.
that was a war that should have never happened, and a lot of people are dying, and it should end. And I don't know, we get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. For you want to know the truth, he's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
And then lastly, this is the last thing I want to show. All of this has led to a number of events that we will talk about. But first and foremost, Trump, Wall Street Journal, is considering Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine, and he is going to give more defensive weapons. Now, this has come after a massive attack by Russia where over 700 drones were used. It seems like every other day the Western mainstream media is saying that Russia is attacking Ukraine and going at Ukraine in the biggest way since the war began. Brian, how about your reaction to all of this?
Well, it's just such a shock and surprise that Donald Trump turned out to be this warmongering neocon. If only somebody could have predicted this and warned everybody that when he was picking his cabinet and picking the worst neocon warmongers in Washington to be part of his cabinet, that this was actually just preparation for continuity of agenda, continued wars absolutely everywhere. There is no scaling back. The only scaling back that is taking place is because the U.S. is literally running out of weapons to fight wars all around the entire planets. No, I don't think it's a deep fake. I don't think it's fake news that President Trump said these things. He practically says these things in public anyway. He has always said these things in public. But the problem is a lot of people who initially supported or even still for some reason support President Trump it's because they're engaging in selective hearing. They're not listening to everything he's saying. They're just picking and choosing the things they want to hear. They want to believe that he's going to, fight the deep state, even though he is part of the deep state, a servant of the deep state. And so they're ignoring this. But when you continuously ignore this, and as events unfold, and we can see what is actually happening with U.S. foreign policy, it just continues toward constant war, absolutely everywhere. And so why would anyone be surprised by him making these comments, past or present or future? I don't understand why anyone would be surprised.
Carl, given what Brian said, I mean, part of this too is the actions behind the words. Not only does Donald Trump say these things, but they're backed up with real policies. At first, it's, we're shutting off weapons, and then suddenly the weapons are turned on, and the Ukraine conflict, since Donald Trump came into office, has not changed one bit. Oh, you're still muted.
I'm old enough to remember when Trump said he will shut down Ukraine war within 24 hours of his election. Does anybody still remember that? But this has been Trump. I mean, I also think the audio is probably authentic. He probably said that he had these talks with Xi and Putin, but this is Trump, whether he actually had those talks with Putin or Xi, that's still open to question. But if he did, it wouldn't surprise me. Basically, that it kind of matches Trump's personality very well. And there's precedents for this. What Trump is doing is actually nothing new. Richard Nixon pioneered the so-called madman theory. That means, to show the enemy that we're so crazy, we're crazy enough to launch a nuclear holocaust that they will back down. And this is actually kind of goes in line with Trump's Art of the Deal, right? In the Art of the Deal, he said, you raise your demand sky high and you force the other side to come down to the table. So I wouldn't be surprised if he actually said those things. But again, why would anybody taking this guy seriously? After everything he's said and done, why would anybody take this guy seriously? You remember what he said about the tariffs, right? And and after a month, less than a month, he backed down and issued a 90 days extension to everybody. Remember what he said about banning TikTok, and then guess what? He issued 90 days extension to TikTok, and he extended again. And this is Trump. Why would anybody, take what Trump says seriously? But you are right. Confucius said, "Listen to one's words, but watch one's action." And Trump, even if it was his intention to shut down the Ukraine war in the beginning, the facts are pretty obvious. He's not, even if his intention was to fight the deep state, and then he obviously lost. And I never believed that he was there to fight the deep state. And people think, oh, Trump is going there and to clean out the globalists from Washington. Like, hello, did you see who is his Treasury Secretary? Scott Bessent? Scott Bessent, the guy who was literally the right-hand man of George Soros. You think he was going there to clean out the Wall Street and the globalists? I mean, come on. There's some institutional inertia that's built in for NATO to continue to dig its heel in Ukraine, and there's some institutional reasons why U.S. keep on getting entangled in Middle East, even if there is a faction, I think, in the U.S. national security establishment that do want to cut their losses in Ukraine and Middle East so they can pivot to China to do the real big civilization war against China. But that's I don't think that's happening, because we're still on the 3-front war plan. as said by the co-founder of Palantir, Alex Karp, and he said that, yeah, we can fight three-front war against Russia, Iran, and China at the same time. So yeah, that's where we're continue that crazy war path, unfortunately.
Yeah, KJ.
Yeah, I agree with both Brian and Carl. And the thing that I think of when I hear all these, fluctuating, insane statements, of course, it is madman theory, but there's also a US torture manual by the CIA called the Kubark. And they specifically mentioned this technique called the Alice in Wonderland technique. And essentially, the idea is to disorient people. One pill makes you large, the other makes you small, just go up and down all over the place. And ultimately, the idea is to constantly barrage, the counterparty with insane messages and then somehow come back to normal and then go insane again. And it's a way of, kind of completely disorienting and psychically demolishing your victim. So I think, it reminds me of that. And of course, it's absurd. We know that, the continuity of the agenda is very clear and obvious. It's a neocon government, but at the same time, there are people who have fallen for this thin veneer of sloganeering and propaganda. Last thing I'll say is, these tariffs, we'll probably get into them in more detail later, but there are several dozen countries that are already subject to these new tariffs. And I'm actually worried about the countries that are not on the tariffs, because it looks like each set of tariffs gets higher and higher. And you can see that there's a taxonomy of tariffs whereby, the vassals get 25%, the grooming and the groomable get about 30%. And then those who are indifferent but could be swayed are in the 35 to 40%. And then it's going to go up from there. And then at the very bottom, you have 20% for the Philippines, which means that it is the ultimate, rear end licking lackey, if you will.
Yeah, well, good points. Brian, what's so interesting is that, well, Russia, China has been, of course, not commenting on these words yet. Russia, Dmitry Peskov has said that these comments, they're not phasing Russia because it's unclear whether they can be verified. But also, it's quite clear. Vladimir Putin told Donald Trump, actually in the phone call, what we can verify is that Russia was going to continue on addressing the root causes of the conflict until they are resolved. And here is what Donald Trump was reacting to, a massive drone strike on Ukraine. And these seem to be happening with more frequency, with more intensity. About 728 from the Western mainstream media, what they're reporting in just a single night. So, Brian, what's your impression of the reality that is being reflected in what seems to be Donald Trump's mask coming off? That's what this appears to be. The rhetoric has completely changed from early in his administration.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for people who were paying very close attention, it was obvious from the beginning that it always was a mask, a very poorly crafted mask. And as KJ said, it's a very, very thin veneer of slogans. And this is for an audience that wants to believe this, not because it's credible, but just because they're so desperate for change, they're willing to believe anything. And you were talking about Russia discussing the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. This is what people always need to do. They need to go back to first principles. What are the first principles of this conflict in Ukraine? Why is it being fought? This is not a dispute between Ukraine and Russia. It's not even a dispute or misunderstanding between the United States and Russia. This is a proxy war the US deliberately engineered, using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia as part of a very well-defined decade-spanning policy of encirclement and containment by NATO around Russia, but also around Iran in the Middle East, and obviously China in the Asia-Pacific region. And so we have all of these conflicts, political interference, political coercion, and capture by the United States, spanning all of Eurasia, obviously even far beyond Eurasia. And it's all to do what? To establish, maintain, expand American primacy. That is the neocon agenda. That is what they seek to do. They want primacy. Policy paper after policy paper spanning the entire 21st century talks about nothing else. There is no other agenda. Maximize profit, maximize power. And so if you hear someone talking about doing something that does not serve that first principle, that root cause, then they're probably lying. They're probably telling you something that you want to hear to, as KJ says, confuse people, to put them off of balance. But I'm sure that policymakers in Russia and also China are well aware of this. They have their own decade-spanning plans to counter this threat that is imposed on them by what is essentially U.S. empire. And so, yes, Russia is going to continue fighting in Ukraine. This is about self-preservation. Again, it's not some misunderstanding or dispute. It's about self-preservation against an empire that refuses to respect national sovereignty anywhere, not just Russia, China, and Iran, but even so-called allies. The U.S. has essentially politically captured Europe, and they have used them also as a battering ram alongside Ukraine, but in a different capacity, but ultimately at the expense of Europe for the benefit of Washington. We have the exact same dynamics playing out in the Middle East. People will argue this with me, but I say that Israel's best interests, actual best interests, are not being served by being at constant war with absolutely everyone around them, their society being heavily militarized, nor are any of these nations politically captured by the US in the Asia Pacific. Japan, South Korea, their full potential never realized because they are subordinated to the US. And obviously the Philippines never had a chance to develop. They are, for an example, just so people understand what political capture by the US does to a country, it has a much larger population than Thailand, where I'm located in Southeast Asia. And yet Thailand has a much larger GDP than the Philippines, which doesn't make any sense, except when you realize the Philippines were literally a US colony from the late 1800s to 1946. And then since then, a de facto colony of the United States. Again, public money in the Philippines, people's time, attention, energy is directed for Washington at the expense of the Philippines, and it shows. So this is the root cause, not just for Russia, but for the entire world faced by constant pursuit of U.S. hegemony.
Yeah, and Carl, I wanted to follow up on what Brian said with a comment you made earlier about the United States being really caught up in a three-front war that Palantir's founder Alex Karp have so boastfully discussed publicly to the Western mainstream media. And it seems that Ukraine, this conflict, it's a forever war. It's one that they can't seem to pull out of. And it doesn't matter that Donald Trump rhetorically said anything at this point, because all of the actions have been escalatory at this point. Your thoughts about this? Why is it that the United States can't seem to pivot in this way that it so hopes to? Because Brian also just wrote an article talking about how the U.S. is still very dangerous despite limitations on its military productive capacity. And at the same time, it keeps pouring whatever it has left into these conflicts.
Well, yeah, I think there's some institutional reasons. NATO exists to contain Russia. There's a lot of jobs at stake, Danny, jobs and careers that depend on this continued hostile stance toward Russia. And Ukraine is linchpin of that. Now, of course, the Trump administration and I think a significant portion of his cabinet wanted to pivot to China, to Asia, but they still think they can what they probably want to do is to have Ukraine as a frozen conflict, sort of what happened after the signing of Minsk agreement. But Russia is not going to fall for the same trick twice. And the right now, especially when Russia is winning on the battlefield, so from perspective of Russia, United States and NATO do not get to dictate terms, but that's a position Trump is not used to, right? U.S. been the unit power for so long, it felt it has the right to dictate the term of peace in Ukraine. But that's not happening. I think this is the pushback taking Trump by surprise. Remember, Trump also has a big ego. This is why he's not happy with Putin, because he thought he was being very generous, extending olive branch to Putin to wrap this up. But Russia, for Russia, this is a more existential issue. The reason they went into Ukraine is because NATO has been building its strength, turning Ukraine as this dagger aiming at Russia's underbelly. They do not want to repeat their mistake with the prior Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2, where they will have a ceasefire and it just allows the time for NATO to supply more equipment, train Ukrainian troops to reignite this conflict somewhere down the road. No, Russia wants to take care of this issue. They wanted to make sure there's permanent neutrality in Ukraine. There will be no NATO. They want guarantee no NATO troops in Ukrainian soil. Whereas the terms that NATO and Trump were throwing out, it's like, oh, okay, we'll send NATO peacekeepers to make sure that there won't be. No. I mean, the whole point of Russia launching the special military operation is no NATO troops in Ukraine. So I think this is a fundamental conflict this is why U.S. are unable to resolve the Ukraine conflict on their terms, because they can't. Russia is winning on the battlefield. Russia will bring this to a conclusion that's on Russia's term, and the U.S. has yet to accept that fact. As for Iran, we all know Israel have an outsized influence in the U.S. politics. And for Netanyahu, it's imperative to drag the United States into the Middle Eastern conflict, because that he needs to remain the wartime president. Otherwise, he will be in jail on corruption charges. So he needs to expand the scope of Israeli aggression to Gaza, to Lebanon, to Iran. And he needs to drag in United States, because he also understands Israel alone cannot take on Iran. He needs United States help. And this is where this is why Trump did that symbolic glancing blow at Iranian nuclear facility, because he on one hand, he wants to be like, I think if Israel could have scored a quick victory, Trump is totally on board with that. Because the Israeli strike on Iran initially wasn't Israeli strike. It was a U.S.-Israeli joint strike. U.S. provided all the satellite intelligence, refueling for Israeli F-35. And according to Israeli media, actually the whole negotiation for ending the nuclear program, which is a ruse to lull the Iranian into a sense of security while Iran to launch their sneak attack. So for Trump, I think if Israel were able to quickly cause a regime collapse in Iran, Trump will be totally up for that. But what he's not up for is to drag into another quagmire like Iraq, because even Trump understands that's deeply unpopular in the United States. As we saw, even within the MAGA camp, many people were against dying for Israel. And so this is why he thought he could thread the needle to launch the symbolic strike against Iran, but telling Iran several days in advance, like, okay, we're gonna attack, but please don't retaliate. We just gotta do this, but don't retaliate. And this way he kind of takes the pressure from Israeli lobby and say, hey, I did my thing. I stood by Israel. I took out Iran's nuclear facility. Now give me a Nobel Peace Prize. And because United States at this point, it doesn't even have. I don't think U.S. even have the capacity to launch a ground invasion, because that's what's needed to do a regime change in Iran. Though we saw they thought they're gonna launch some strike and Iran government is gonna fall, but it turns out Iranian people, being very patriotic people, they rally around the flag. So they couldn't do what NATO did in Libya. When the NATO bombing started, they just found some opposition to march on the capital. That wasn't happening in Iran. The only way they could do that is if they send in ground troops. And I don't think U.S. even has the capacity at this point to launch a ground invasion of Iran. Because back in 2003, they moved 170,000 troops to Gulf to start the Iraq invasion. Today, I don't think U.S. even have the capacity to ship 170,000 troops to Middle East on a short notice. And so this is why the Middle East is going to keep on simmering, because there's a slight conflict of goal between Israel and United States. U.S. want Israel to be its proxy, to destabilize Middle East, whereas Netanyahu wants Americans to do the bleeding for Israel. So I think because of that, U.S. will continually embroil in the Middle East, but I think I don't think any kind of full-scale war is in the cards between U.S. and Iran, and which brings back to China. They're never going to pivot to Asia. They're never going to pivot to China, despite the rhetoric. They keep on saying that we got to pivot our resources to Western Pacific to come from China. But if you actually watch what's actually happening on the ground, contrary to the rhetoric, they're actually retreating. Now they're pulling back from the first island chain. The first island chain being this is a Cold War term when they created the so-called first island chain to contain Soviet Union and China that stretched from Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, all throughout South China Sea. But they have been pulling back from the first island chain back to the second island chain. Now they're trying to hardening their hold on Guam as a forward base. But recently the Chinese Navy just sent two carrier attack groups that broke through the first island chain and did their own freedom of navigation patrol around Guam. So now even the second island chain is looking wobbly for United States. So I do not think they will ever be able to pivot to Asia just because the U.S. empire has been bogged down on so many other fronts.
Yeah, and KJ, I feel like one of the approaches, or maybe the main approach from the Trump administration, that is almost like an exercise in branding, because Brian outlines the deception, Carl outlines, you all outlined the deception quite clearly, but the actual direction appears to be almost a misguided hope that Vladimir Putin would just settle and pause this conflict, that Israel, if there's going to be any kind of kinetic warfare in West Asia beyond what's already going on with the genocide, etc., that Israel would just do it all. Meanwhile, Israel is saying, help, 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 give us everything that we need to bomb Iran, so that China could be more of a focus. But that doesn't seem to be what's happened, KJ.
Yeah, it's as Brian has pointed out on many occasions, there's this whole notion of strategic sequencing and the division of labor, which is clearly not working according to plan. But it's as, Mike Tyson has said, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the jaw, right? And then all, plans go awry. I think the thing to remember is that ultimately the goal is and always has been China. If you think of it as a kind of a three-course meal, there was a question in numerous administrations. We know that the ultimate goal is China. China is the main dish, but there was a question about sequencing. Do we knock out China first and then, go to Russia for the dessert? Or do we knock out Russia as the starter and go to China and then finish off Iran as dessert, etc.? There were questions around sequencing. And clearly, the Nuland faction was ascendant, and they decided to trigger war with Russia first. Now, there are a couple of issues that became very, very clear. First, the United States has not fought a war with a peer competitor since 1945, since World War II. And in the past 2.5 decades, it really hasn't engaged in war. It's essentially engaged in hunting. It's been hunting insurgents with high-tech weaponry. And then because of that, it's deluded itself into thinking that it is once again this hyperpower that, as I think McMaster said, have a plan, be polite, be professional, have a plan to kill everybody. And they thought that they could kill everybody. And certainly they saw Russia as they said, a gas station, right? A gas station with nukes, that they would just polish it off. This was the starter course before they went to the main dish. And of course, they would soften it up and weaken it with economic warfare that turned the ruble into rubble. Well, that didn't work out so well. So they miscalculated on all these different fronts. And now, having realized that, they're trying to pick up the pieces and reorient. And they still, I believe, despite Carl's, optimistic view, I believe that they're still dead set on waging war with China. And they also know that the clock is working against them, because every year they delay the war, China becomes stronger, and the US simply just hollows itself out more and more. And as you can see in these recent wars, not only is the US hollowed out and China strengthening, but the global South, the BRICS countries, are also becoming more and more powerful. They're knitting themselves together like a Go board, and they're just becoming more and more harder to resist, to take down simply. And then we can also see, very specific challenges to U.S. war technology. For example, if you look at, the U.S. had the greatest single Patriot engagement in U.S. military history during the Iran missile crisis. They moved THAAD missile batteries to Israel. They were using, SM-3s, SM-6s, THAAD, Patriot missile batteries, Iron Dome, David Sling, the whole 9 yards. They were using everything they had, and they were essentially pulverized. Iran said, we're only using 5% of our capacity, and yet the Israelis were pulverized. As they said, there's never been this amount of damage in Israel's history, the Director General of Israel's tax authority. So they were pulverized. And so the US is starting to get a dose of reality, what it means to engage in real warfare rather than hunt down, insurgents in Toyota trucks, who were sheep herders. So I think there's a real kind of awakening, but I believe that they're still deeply embedded, deeply wedded to attacking China, and still deeply, wedded to the notion that they are the supreme power. It's, as I said before, it's the grizzly bear fallacy. The 6% of Americans believe that they can attack and fight a grizzly bear with their bare hands and take it down.
Yeah, and Brian, this is a good place, I think, to segue into a conversation about recent reports relating to Iran. And because we've talked a lot about on this show, Brian, the need for the multipolar world, especially the three biggest leaders of it, Russia, China, and Iran, to coordinate more. And we have reports from Middle East Eye. Iran receives China's surface-to-air missile batteries after Israel's ceasefire deal. The Islamic Republic is trading oil for China's air defense missiles as it looks to rebuild capacities destroyed by Israel. Now, I also want to show you this. So during the BRICS summit, Sergei Lavrov said that Russia is ready to help Iran with its civilian nuclear program, which was heavily damaged in these bombings. Now, Brian, Benjamin Netanyahu is having a really extended stay at the White House. And there's many who are saying, reports are coming out that one of the big reasons for this is that there's coordination and discussion about another attack on Iran. We know that's coming. So talk about the significance of these developments then, of Iran looking to China to bolster its defenses, and how you see the coming days here as the discussion that you've had about strategic sequencing, division of labor, seem to be bearing much fruit.
Yes, what Carl and KJ are talking about is what is, a lot of people make the mistake of looking at each one of these conflicts in isolation. This is all part of one single geopolitical objective the US has. And again, it is about establishing, maintaining, expanding global primacy. Every single one of these conflicts is linked to the other. The United States is trying to overthrow the government of Iran. It's not about their nuclear program. It is about regime change. It's about regime change everywhere. They want regime change in Iran, in Russia, in China. And at a minimum, they want to contain these countries, but ultimately they want to subordinate them and control them, politically capture them. And so this was not going to ever end with the US just carrying out strikes on Iran's nuclear program. What this was basically the beginning of direct warfare between the US and Iran, and also between the US proxy Israel and Iran. This perceived political limit of striking at Iran directly rather than through proxies or fighting proxy wars elsewhere in the region, that is over. Now it is direct warfare. And yes, this concept of strategic sequencing and division of labor is the manifestation of people in Washington on Wall Street realizing the limits to their power, the rising multipolar world, and the realities that they do not have unlimited military, economic, political, diplomatic power. And they have to conserve it and use it very, very carefully now. They cannot wage a three-front war like Carl was referring to this Palantir head talking about waging a three-front war. It literally is impossible. And it's impossible for all of these reasons we've been discussing. The missiles alone, not just air defense missiles, but offensive capabilities. The US simply does not make enough missiles to wage any one of these wars, let alone all three of them at the same time. They make something like 550 to 600 Patriot missile interceptors every single year. Russia makes over 800 Iskander missiles a year. And you would need about 2, probably more interceptors, Patriot interceptors, to take down one Iskander. And that is happening every single day in Ukraine. And so they don't even have half of the missiles they need just for Ukraine, let alone for waging war against Iran in the Middle East, and certainly not waging a war against China in the Asia Pacific. And so, Danny, you're talking about what is going to happen in Iran. Everybody is reloading, everybody is preparing. Yeah. There was a lot of talk about, Iran needs Su-35 or Chinese warplanes. That's unrealistic. There's a reason Iran picked air defense and ballistic missiles, because it was the most realistic option they could pick that would be effective against the military capabilities of the US and Israel. You're not going to get 25 or even 50 Chinese or Russian warplanes and fight and overcome 200, 300 US Israeli warplanes. And you have to remember, it's not just how many warplanes you have. Experience, training, infrastructure, intel, all of these things mount in the US and Israelis' favor in terms of air power. So Iran is focusing on their strengths. Their strengths are air defense and ballistic missiles. So it makes perfect sense if China is resupplying Iran with air defense systems. It makes perfect sense. That's what is working, and they need more of that. And if they get more of that, and they get help with their ballistic missiles, this is going to balance things better in their favor. I always warn people not to underestimate the US, its capacity to kill and destroy things. People underestimated them in terms of Syria and how overextended both Russia and Iran were in that regards. And Syria is now a proxy. And Carl said the US cannot invade Iran on the ground. Probably not. But they have HTS, who is now being delisted under the Trump administration. Literally, Al-Qaeda in Syria is being delisted. And why do you think that is? So that the US can openly arm and back them in a proxy war against either Iran directly or its allies in the region.
Carl, I know you've been covering Iran's seemingly pivot. I don't call it a pivot to China just because China was already supplying air defenses in the past. But it appears from recent reports that Iran is really, as Brian said, looking to regroup and rearm, and China is its primary source. Now, China has not necessarily verified these reports. They just said that their foreign ministry spokesperson said they're willing to give military equipment to friendly countries. Iran is a friendly country. So your analysis.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that we can take that as a confirmation. And I agree with Brian. It actually makes perfect sense for Iran to get air defense system first, because what we saw in that 12-day war is that Iran's missiles were causing major havoc in Israel. This is for the first time Tel Aviv and Haifa was getting hit. For the first time, Israel no longer can push their aggression with impunity. However, Israeli air superiority meant that they were, Israeli F-35s were in air hunting down missile launchers on the western side of Iran. Now, this is obviously not ideal because Iran's capability to inflict hurt on Israel is, major reason why Israel end up suing for ceasefire. So Iran need to make sure their missile launchers are protected. That's where Iran has advantage, because Iran has tens of thousands of missiles. But if they can't, deploy their missile launchers, because of the fear of Israeli aerial attack, that could be a problem. So in terms of air defense, people have to remember the international arms embargo on Iran was only lifted in October 2022, right? And so Iran didn't actually have much time to build up their air defense before the Israeli attack. Now, I know there's talks why Russia haven't delivered S-300 or S-400. But people need to realize right now Russia's priority is Ukraine. That's an existential issue for them. That's what Russia is concentrated on. Whereas China, according to the Western media, China have issue of overcapacity. Right, for China to supply those air defense system, there's no supply bottleneck. As opposed to U.S. supplying missiles to missile interceptor to Israel, as Brian again pointed out. The United States deployed THAAD batteries to protect Israel. Now, those THAAD batteries, radar, launcher, everything together, each one cost $1 billion with a B, and each THAAD missiles cost between 12 to 13 million dollars, and pretty soon it adds up to real money. And the United States planned production for that missile interceptor was 12 for the year of 2025. So guess what? Israel has just fired off more than 1 year's supplies of that missiles. They fired off more than 1 year's supply of that missiles over Israel in course of 12 days. And there's no way United States will be able to keep up with that to supply Israel. And there's a real resource constraint because China's export control on rare earth minerals. For U.S. missiles, F-35, they require the Samarian cobalt heat-resistant magnets that come from China, and China has put on the export control on those both the rare earth itself and also the rare earth magnets since last year. This was a response to U.S. chip sanction against China, and this is why Trump was getting really huff and puff, and then finally in their trade talks at London, at first Geneva and then London, they resolved that China agreed to grant export license of rare earth and rare earth magnets to United States car makers, right? So which means for 6 months, which means right now every companies who want rare earth from China, they have to fill out an application to the Chinese Commerce Ministry and say, please, sir, can I have some rare earth? And once the approval is again pending on their behavior. If China detects that they're directing that supply to, say, U.S. defense industries, guess what? That stuff can be stopped anytime. So and also, for people concerned about that, there's a different. The military grade magnet is completely different from what goes into car production. The F-35 requires a lot more of those rare earth components than what goes into a regular car. And so this is the Chinese export control can be quite crippling to the U.S. military industrial complex. And plus, the U.S. just doesn't have the industrial capacity anymore to keep up with the battlefield depletion in both Ukraine and Israel. And this is why Israel sued for peace. But on the other hand, because the quote-unquote Chinese overcapacity, they have no problem. There's no supply bottleneck for China to supply air defense missiles to Iran. And that will clearly happen because I was a bit skeptical, but when Chinese foreign ministry says we're ready to share our achievement with the friendly countries, I think that's a pretty much a confirmation. And this is actually pretty huge. China, Russia, Iran, they were already in the BRICS together. Iran is a full BRICS member, but now with the exchange with the weapon sales, it's not just simply as exchanging hardware for money. It's actually building of relationships, because what that means now, Iranian operators will have to go to China for training. The Chinese will come to Iran to install and do maintenance, and this is a decade-long relationship building exercise. This is why United States, by the way, love weapon sales, and except US use weapon sale as a leverage to tell countries what to do or what not to do. For example, when US sold F-16s to Pakistan, they made Pakistan sign an end user agreement that those F-16s cannot be used in a war against India, right? Whereas China weapon sale comes with no strings attached. China is not going to tell Iran, oh no, you cannot use this against Israel. No, like, it's yours. Go ahead, have fun. And this brings the alignment of China, Iran, and also Russia much more closer together than even before. I think this is it's a move in the positive direction, and I am pretty sure that's something that also put United States and Israel on notice. Iran is not alone.
Yeah, and KJ, the timing of these reports are not a coincidence. Iran just experienced a major war of aggression, and now Iran is seeking help to ensure that any future, what will be a war of attrition, Brian laid it out quite clearly. This is not going to be. There's going to be no quick, massive scale wars. The U.S. just can't fight it, but they're going to try to grind Iran down, and it seems Iran is more than willing to get help from anybody it can, especially China and Russia, to ensure its survival. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
This is going to go into attritional warfare, but the thing to remember is, I think, very important lesson from Russia is that the U.S. and the U.S. allies are not good at doing a war of attrition. They like quick blitzkrieg, decapitation strikes. This was the Israeli doctrine of war, and this comes out of the Yom Kippur War, which later became the U.S. doctrine of war against the Soviet Union, air-land battle, and then now they have a doctrine of war against China, air-sea battle. All of this comes out of Israeli war doctrine from the Yom Kippur War, but primarily it's focused on rapid decapitation, deep strikes inland, very, very aggressive, violent, vicious tactics. And then if that doesn't happen, then we see the result. They try to engage in genocide. But there are a couple of things that I think are important to highlight. First, the relationship between China and Iran has been building over the last several decades. But you have to look at the historical, scope. And if you look at that, you understand that Iran and China have had a long history of very good relations, going back to the Sasanian dynasty, in the 600s, 14 centuries ago, that the Sasanian dynasty took refuge with the Tang dynasty, when they were Islamicized. And if you look, for example, at, 14th century manuscripts like the Court of Kayumars, which, tells the history of Iran, it's an illuminated manuscript. If you look at the pictures, they are Chinese style, landscape paintings. It's very, very Chinese. So you can see that over millennia, there's been a very, very close relationship. And of course, in the current moment, China knows that, both Russia and Iran, and of course China, they're all targets. And so they have to work together. Certainly, they're going to support one another. China has certainly the industrial strength and the supply chains. And I think the other thing which is very striking is the U.S. and in particular Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand the concept of a supply chain. He's only worked in real estate. Real estate really doesn't have a supply chain. Land doesn't have a supply chain, and a building or a real estate only has a few hundred, a few thousand pieces. But a single jet fighter has 350,000 components, and all of them. A large number of them come from come from China or from other parts in Asia. So I think that in terms of war, the contradiction is that if the US were to wage war against China or against China's allies, then it would very rapidly discover that it is waging war against its own supply chain. And Carl mentioned rare earth elements. Of course, rare earth elements are critical for modern technology. Not the least of it are, magnets. If you heat a magnet, if you want to demagnetize a magnet, you heat it. But we know that rare earth elements, samarium and others, you can create magnets that will tolerate extreme high heat. And so these are critical in weapons components. And they're also critical simply because the entire ecosystem under which we function, which is, electronic, is derived from electromagnetic force, which involves magnets. Magnets are critical to modern technology. So there's a real misunderstanding of the supply chains, of vulnerabilities, of the complexities of war on this hybrid economic supply chain logistical level. And then here's the other piece, which is incredibly, I think, ironic, is that, for example, the United States criticized China for not supplying cotton for their artillery shells, for the gun cotton. But what everybody forgot was that it was the United States that had sanctioned China's Xinjiang cotton and said, you can't sell this anywhere. And having created a global shortage of cotton, then they said, shoot, we don't have cellulose for gun cotton for M50, 155 millimeter shells. And then they started to, complain that China was withholding gun cotton from them. So once again, this incredible stupidity, short-sightedness, contradictory misunderstanding of what real strategic competition looks like. I think these are the weaknesses of the United States, which doesn't mean that they aren't crazy enough to continue to accelerate to war.
Yeah, and Brian, that's been the point you've been making, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Iran rearms and is able to once again engage in a war of attrition without being toppled in that moment, right? It doesn't matter if the situation isn't as favorable as the 12-day war showed, that the U.S., Israel, they could kill people, they could bomb nuclear sites, they couldn't topple the government. But you've said that this is going to keep on going regardless, and sometimes there is, I think, an assumption that there's some rationality here that, okay, well, if it's not really going to work out, if this isn't in the interest of the United States, if it's not going to, if there aren't objectives that are going to be met, then they'll stop. But that's not the case, is it, Brian?
No, it's not, because the entire system the U.S. is based on is one of corporate financier interests. They are propelled not by any specific purpose to serve society, but solely to acquire greater and greater profit, which is why the U.S. industrial base looks the way it does. Everything was outsourced without any thought of national security or any purpose to actually serve the idea of you're making things for people to do things, not just to make money. So the outsourcing was perfect for maximizing profit, but it made little sense in basically all other ways, conceivable ways. And the problem that they have now is, even as they try to expand production, their entire industrial base, and they even put out a report, the National Industrial Strategy, where they were talking about, we have all these private corporations making things, and if there's not, you know, a demand signal and there's not a compelling business case, they simply won't make these things in the quantities that we need to wage all of these wars. So you have a system that is inherently compelled to constantly pursue greater power and profit, but the system by design is incapable of manufacturing the weapons and all of the other capabilities required to actually do this. And this is something that happens to empires all throughout history. They overextend themselves, and they're so obsessed with pursuing profit and power, they don't actually invest in the things required to get it. China, on the other hand, and Russia, and actually many other countries around the world, people don't understand this. They are using a combination of tools like free markets, but also a purpose-driven society, purpose-driven industry. I remember President Xi Jinping, when he was talking about the real estate crisis in China, he said houses are meant to be lived in. They're meant to be lived in. They're not supposed to be vehicles for speculation. Try telling that to anybody in the United States. Good luck convincing them or getting any sort of policy regarding that. Now, no, the United States is not going to stop its pursuit of war with Iran, with Russia, with China. As I said before, there is this global conflict, is a global kind of slow motion World War III, war of attrition that is taking place. You can see the limits, some of the limits the US has. You can see some of the limits Russia and China actually have. I'll give an example. People could understand, and Carl mentioned S-300, S-400 systems can't be sent to Iran in huge numbers because Russia is waging war basically against all of NATO in Ukraine. So it's not possible. China also has limits. They have a very compelling deal they can make with all of these nations, partnerships they can make with all these nations. The US literally has no alternative for. So China comes to Thailand, where I'm based, and they say, we can do all of these things for you. We can build high-speed rail. We could do all kinds of trade. We have tourists. We have more tourists coming from China to Thailand than all Western countries combined. But the problem is, even though the U.S. cannot compete in this way, the U.S. competes in other ways by coercing and politically capturing a targeted country. So the media space here in Thailand is heavily controlled and influenced by the U.S. and Thailand does not have the ability to push this out. They tried, say, like an NGO law to stop the NED from interfering, and the U.S. just put more and more pressure on the Thai government until they were forced to abandon it. Things like that prevent nations from fully pivoting towards China. So they're constantly playing this balancing act where they're trying to keep the U.S. from burning their country down, but they also obviously, I mean, the only real sustainable relationship they can have is with a nation like China within multipolarism. So this is the large scale geopolitical landscape all of this is taking place in. It's not just these wars. It is U.S. interference all around the globe. It is coercion and political capture. All of these nations are trying to balance. And even though China makes the most compelling, opportunities, let's just say opportunities, a nation is looking at that, but then they're also looking at the U.S. will kill us. They will kill me. They will sanction me. They will destabilize my society. So even though the U.S. has nothing to offer and much less energy is being put into destabilizing the country, it's a more compelling form of coercion than say Chinese economic persuasion, positive persuasion versus negative coercion.
Yeah, and this is why for Iran, you know, a lot of people criticize Iran. They say Iran didn't do this, they didn't do that, they're too weak, they're not going strong enough. I think people don't appreciate a lot of times in the collective West that self-determination and sovereignty are just such critical components to just being able to exist and develop independently. And Iran, regardless of whoever's been leader in Iran for the last since 1979, they've been able to achieve that, and that's why they are still standing after what was a significant war of aggression, and that's why they're rearming and regrouping. Now it's they know it's inevitable, and regardless of whatever minutia of what decisions they make that some people may see as a mistake or not good enough or what have you, the fact of the matter is that Iran would not be standing right now without sovereignty, with the maximum pressure sanctions. If it didn't have China as a partner, if it wasn't willing to do, Brian, what you say many countries are just not able to do. They're not able to be in the Belt and Road, or even if they are in the Belt and Road, they're not able to finish projects. That's one of the biggest issues in the Belt and Road Initiative, is these governments are not prepared to equally invest, and some projects just aren't going to get done. So that's a big issue, but Iran appears to be moving forward, and we're going to have to keep track of the next phase, the next chapter, as Netanyahu gets his room in Washington, D.C. and stays there for however long to coordinate and collaborate around another strike. But Carl, I want to talk to you now, again, because as no one is looking at this because of Ukraine, because of Iran, what happened in the 12-day war, and of course now with the tariff frenzy, no one's really looking at the Pacific as a theater of war, but the United States is indeed doing this. And I don't know if you've seen the reports about the huge exercises that the U.S. Air Force are about to put on. The Air Force's largest Pacific contingency response exercise is going to go from July 10th to August 8th. It's going to take place in the Pacific, Guam, Hawaii, Japan, international airspace, and it's going to involve 300 aircraft. It specifically is all about China, Carl. There's also exercises happening in Taiwan right now. These specifically name China as the adversary that is being trained against. It's all about combat realism, according to reports. These Han Kuang exercises are testing and exercising around a prolonged People's Liberation Army, China's Liberation Army attack. And they're going to be doubled in length this time for 10 days. So, Carl, talk about these exercises, what they reflect, what they mean for this pivot to Asia, which the U.S. is struggling to put sole focus on, given its very overstretched capacity all around the world.
Well, Brian already said, despite all the resource constraint on the U.S. empire, it doesn't mean they will not still attempt to do it, to cause tension and to stir up war. But if you look at where those exercises actually take place, around Guam and Hawaii, Guam is on the second island chain, and Hawaii is on the third island chain. These are well beyond the so-called the first island chain, where U.S. was originally hoped to contain China. I think at this point they have realized that's a fruitless exercise, because the entire first island chain is under the range of Chinese missile barrages. So now they're trying to float the idea. Okay, what if we fight China beyond the Chinese missile range? Let's just park our aircraft carriers very, very far where they can't hit us, and then we put extra fuel tankers on the outside of our F-35 to give them extra range so they can fly to bomb China. This is ridiculous. China is now they just started their production on J-35, their naval carrier-based aircraft, their fifth generation stealth fighter. But China also flew 2 prototype of their 6th generation stealth fighter. Now, United States 6th generation stealth fighter, the so-called next air dominance, is still at the PowerPoint presentation phase. So judging by the China's pace of military deployment, they probably will be able to deploy those 6th generation fighters by 2030. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, that means, contrary to what Washington was saying, there will be no big plans on move on Taiwan before 2030. Because why not wait 2030 when you have even more advantage versus 2027? Now, the Washington, particularly Pentagon, has been floating this idea, China is going to kick off the Taiwan war anytime now. Back in 2023, the U.S. Admiral says China could kick off the Taiwan war within 2 years. Well, that would be this year, folks. That would be 2025. I mean, we still have 6 months left, but I don't think that's likely. And then later they floated the idea that it's going to be a Taiwan war in 2027. Look, this is not. If a war is going to break out, it will not be initiated by China. If you look at all this investment China is pouring in on the mainland side of the Taiwan Strait, China does not expect there to be a war. But whereas U.S. is getting increasingly desperate because they're the one who realize their time window for stopping China's rise is rapidly diminishing. The whole idea of their floating a 2025 war or 2027 war is because they want to be able to fight China within the U.S. time window. They know by 2030 it will be hopeless. It will be hopeless for United States try to contain China's power. This is why I remain optimistic. I don't think these noises that U.S. is making will have any material effect on the ground. And because ultimately their war plans, they're still trying to fight Pacific War. They think this is going to be a Pacific War 2.0, right? They know, okay, we know how the playbook played out. We did the island hopping, and then we defeated Japan. But what they don't realize is fundamentally the power of balance have shifted, especially with China being now the manufacturing superpower of the world. Whereas on the other hand, the Wall Street elite has been hollowing out the U.S. manufacturing sector for the last 40 years. The Pentagon admitted itself, China has 200 times the shipbuilding capability than United States. U.S. only have like 3 shipyards that builds for U.S. Navy, whereas any one of China's 7 shipyard is bigger than all U.S. shipyard combined. And so there. If a war is to break out, if it will be a Pacific War, but in reverse. United States will be in the position of Imperial Japan in 1941, and China will be in the position of the United States in 1941. That is the power differential in terms of industrial capacity. And that's something that I think even elites in Washington are slowly coming to realize. This is why now Pentagon is proposing a deal where they're going to need help of South Korea and Japan to help United States with a naval buildup. They hollow out the manufacturing so much in United States. Now it's starting to impact the U.S. military industrial complex. And Trump said he wants to bring manufacturing back to U.S. Pentagon already gave up on manufacturing in the United States. There's actually a congressional law that says it forbids to build foreign warships outside the United States. But now they're trying to circumnavigate the U.S. law to go have quote unquote retrofit U.S. ships in South Korea and Japan, because U.S. simply don't have the capability. And this is at the time when Donald Trump is slapping 25% tariff on South Korea and Japan, and Donald Trump slapped 25% tariff on foreign autos and auto parts, and Japan and South Korea is getting hit disproportionately, because unlike China, China don't sell any cars in the United States, so this auto tariff doesn't even affect China. Japan and South Korea actually heavily depend on export for their economy, and they heavily depend on the U.S. auto market. So this issue is existential for them, and U.S. cannot hope to fight a war or contain China without looping its vassal states, U.S. and South Korea along, but because they will need forward bases, etc. Like Brian mentioned many times, U.S. is fighting the distance of tyranny to bring resources all the way across the Pacific to fight China. So that's why they desperately need those bases. Yet, what Donald Trump's policy is doing is pushing Japan and South Korea closer toward China. China, South Korea, Japan, and Southeast ASEAN country recently have met together. They're going to form a free trade zone that's going to cover 2 billion people, more than 2 billion people, because China have 1.4 billion people, Southeast Asia have 680 million people, Japan has like 140 million. South Korea maybe 50. My figure might be rusty, but altogether it's more than 2 billion people. It's going to be huge. It's going to be the world's largest free trade zone, and Donald Trump is a great peacemaker of East Asia. Give that guy a Nobel Peace Prize already, and this is why I remain optimistic about the future. There's actually a article in the foreign former Singapore diplomat Kishore Mubani repeatedly said, please, United States, do not make us to choose between U.S. and China, because we don't want to make that choice. For decades, Southeast Asia loved to be able to have a relationship both with China and United States, because they depend on China for their economic growth. But what Kishore is really saying is, if you force us to choose, when the shit hit the fan, we're going to have to choose China. And that's already happening. There's a recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine says Southeast Asia already starting choosing, because ultimately Southeast Asia economic destiny lies with China. ASEAN is China's largest trade partner right now, replacing United States. And there's a lot of Chinese investment coming to Southeast Asia, whereas United States is offering only sticks, no carrots. Donald Trump is throwing big sticks to everybody. Sanction, tariff. He's not offering any kind of sweetener deal. United States not offering investment into the region. They're not offering helping with the infrastructure project, and those are the things that Southeast Asian nations need. This is why over long term and intermediate term, I'm still fairly optimistic about Taiwan. The Hangguang military exercise is it's a routine military exercise. What's the difference this time is that it's much bigger in scale. But guess what? When it comes to the issue of Taiwan independence, the Taiwan military is dead set against it. They're probably the most the one institution on Taiwan that's most against Taiwan independence. Taiwan independence, that formal Taiwan independence, that would be the trigger for war. And Taiwan military is not up for that. And so despite all these exercises, Taiwan is not going to be the one that's going to be at least the Taiwan military is not going to be the one that fires the first shot, because the expectation in U.S. is that, okay, we're going to build a porcupine strategy in Taiwan. We're going to make Taiwan's devote a larger share of their GDP to the military spending. So when it comes to war with China, those Taiwanese will bleed and die for us, just like the Ukrainians are bleeding and die for us. But even for the most hardcore Taiwan separatists, their goal has always been to make Americans to bleed and die for their independence. So this is why if a war breaks out, most of them will be on a plane, to Irvine, California. So I mean, this is the expectation that some American thinkers think that the Taiwanese is going to take into the hills and fighting guerrilla war. That's completely unrealistic. This is why I am still fairly optimistic that things are going to remain calm. There will be tensions because United States, that's U.S.'s job to continue to stir up tension in the Western Pacific so they can justify the $1 trillion military budget. But I don't see a prospect for like a hot kinetic war breaking out anytime soon.
Yeah, and KJ, we always hear the reasons why there are these drills. It's what China is doing. These drills that are annual and that Carl was mentioning that are happening on Taiwan. But it's all about China being aggressive. China is doing this. China is doing that. Talk about your reaction to these exercises, where they fit. As Carl said, they come at a time where major U.S. allies in this region, like South Korea and Japan, are being slapped with pretty major tariffs. And the U.S., at least in both rhetoric and now economic policy, is punishing the very countries that they need to lean on for a broader war with China. But as I like to say, they're not leaning on these countries. They're actually the U.S. is putting their foot on their neck. So, KJ, your reaction to these exercises and what they reflect?
Well, I think putting, the foot on the neck is pretty standard. It's essentially coercion. They're mostly sticks, not carrots. And I think, from a larger standpoint, you could make the argument, if you want to use business terms, is that China is going long on the global south, whereas the U.S. is shorting. It's shorting the global south. It wants it all to collapse and to engage in war, and that's how it's going to win. Regarding, the Hanguang exercises themselves, I think what's notable in this set of exercises is that very recently, Taiwan has purchased 29 HIMARS missile launchers, and it's received 11 already. And they're actually going to use these in the exercise. This is just one more level of escalation, as opposed to, quote, harpoons or NASAMS or Patriots, which you could ostensibly argue that they have some kind of defensive capacity. The HIMARS are offensive weapons, and you can hit at least 20 mainland cities from Taiwan, major cities like Xiamen, Ningde, Putian, etc. You can hit all of these cities from Taiwan. So this is tremendously escalatory. At the same time, of course, that we know that it's completely foolish. I mean, if we go back to, once again, Iran and Israel, one of the reasons why Iran was able to prevail is simply size. Size matters. Iran is 80 times the size of Israel. Well, the thing is, China is 6 times the size of Iran, and Taiwan, is 1.5 times the size of Israel. In other words, China is over 260 times larger than Taiwan Island. So if it was simply a matter of, firing missiles, then it would completely, there would be no possibility of this having any, effect on China. But what we do have to note is that the U.S. is very, very determined in using Taiwan to trigger a war against China, whether the Taiwanese want it or not, whether the KMT wants it or not, they want to do it. And so, several years ago, the US passed the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act, which is essentially a declaration of war against China. And it has written into its, provisions the idea that they're going to micromanage and micro-audit the Taiwan military. So this is still, the plans are in action, and they're very, very, the momentum is extreme. I don't think that we're going to see this dialed back anytime soon. I'm going to throw a little bit of cold water on the optimism, because I think it's important that we, don't be too buoyed up with optimism. Just really, think of the possibilities, the risks involved. I think that the US understands that it is industrially overmatched by China. And we know that in wars, the industrial power always wins. But what they have been doing, as others have pointed out, is that they have been trying to offshore their military industrial supply chain to Korea, of course, to Japan, and also to India. They want India to, build, for example, jet engines, as well as, the electronics. And there are Korean shipyards that have already signed agreements with the United States to fix immediate battle damage to American ships. So these plans are very, very far advanced. They're thinking that, if a ship gets damaged in the Pacific, instead of moving it back to the United States, they're just going to fix it in theater in Korea. And there are a bunch of Korean corporations that are used to working with American corporations. For example, Hyundai, the car maker, was actually a subsidiary, a subcontract to Brown and Root or Halliburton during the Vietnam War. So these relationships exist already, and they're being tweaked and turned and weaponized into very, very specific, concrete preparations for war. I think the other thing to understand is that, the US has this doctrine of different offsets against war. The first offset is that, if your adversary has a conventional advantage, you just use a bigger bomb. This is the first offset. It's mass. If the other adversary gets a big bomb as well, then you use the second offset. The second offset is you use precision, and you knock those bombs out before they can be launched. So this is the entire generation of, cruise missiles and, targeted missiles, etc. Well, if your adversary has precision and mass, then what is your offset? And this is what the US has been preparing over the last decade, which is diffusion and dispersion. That's why they're dispersing all across the first island chain, all across the second island chain, all the way to the third island chain. This is why they're looking for every scrap of asphalt along the island chains and seeing how they can weaponize them. And this is the whole notion of scoot and shoot, etc. So they've been working on using distribution, diffusion, and dispersion, as well as long-range standoff, which ties into that, as well as subsurface warfare, to see if they can offset the kind of natural, geographic, and time advantage that China has. And then here's the kicker, and this is where Karp and Palmer Luckey and all these Peter Thiel come in, is that they also believe that they can use AI to dominate the war field. And that's why they want to have this kind of digital Wolfowitz doctrine over the use of AI. This is all this, sanctions against other countries using DeepSeek and forcing them to use American AI, because they want that kind of Wolfowitz doctrine of AI, because they believe that this is the killer app. This is the thing that will be able to knock out and subjugate all US enemies, in particular China. DeepSeek has thrown that for a loop, but they're still thinking in that way. And then the last piece, and I say that this with great reluctance, but I think it's also important for us to understand, is that currently the Undersecretary of Defensive Policy is Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby comes out of the Marathon Institute and the Center for New American Security. And for a decade now, he has been arguing for the use of nukes in war. In particular, Let me read you this. He's talking about the deliberate use of nuclear weapons over Taiwan. And he says, before the House Armed Services Committee, the U.S. needs to adapt its nuclear policy and posture and be ready to fight a limited nuclear war more effectively in a situation where the United States, this is in CNAS, in which the United States has lost the conventional advantage, which it already has. U.S. nuclear weapons should play a vital role in bringing a war that the United States and its allies are losing to a tolerable close. And then he talks about the necessity for forward deploying theater nuclear forces, dual capable aircraft, etc. And then if you go on to the RAND website, you'll see that they're teaching their interns, the RAND interns, how to use nukes. So, this is very, very deeply set up, and they're they're really committed to this. And so this is the real danger. They're thinking that they can prevail by using AI and nukes. We can't ignore this.
Yeah, and Brian, I want to get you in here because I know you had a reaction to these particular exercises, particularly from the U.S. Air Force. As many people may assume that because we're criticizing the Trump administration and because Donald Trump is president, that somehow our programs, our analyses are all Trump derangements and we're only going after Trump. But the point here is that there is a big continuity, even in just these very particular military exercises against China, that spans beyond Trump. So, Brian, your analysis on these exercises and anything else you want to add to this discussion.
Yes, I just want to say I used to share Carl's optimism, and in particular about Europe before the special military operation began in 2022. I honestly believed, because all of the signs were there, and it was such an obvious, logical choice for Europe to work its way out from under the US and work more closely with Russia and China. And at that time, they were actually, before 2014, I should say. And then the US overthrew the government in Ukraine. And because the US has already politically captured Europe, that is what the European Union is a layer of bureaucracy that is thrown over and smothers European sovereignty. It was able to get all of these countries in line and to work against their own best interests, their individual best interests and Europe's collective best interests, to wage what would become an ever-escalating proxy war against Russia. And I'm almost certain that is what will happen here in the Asia-Pacific region with Japan, with South Korea, the Philippines, the island province of Taiwan, the administration there. They will all get in line, and they will do whatever the U.S. tells them to do, because they are all completely dependent on the U.S. The U.S. will not afford them any other alternative. That is the whole concept of politically capturing a nation in the first place. People have to be very, very, very careful about that. I wish that it was any other way. I had wished Europe would have went in another direction, but I just don't see it at this point. I think KJ brought up a lot of good points about AI. I heard Eric Schmidt, who had formerly been the head of Google, he outright said that whoever wins the AI arms race, their system will dominate the planet, because it will give you such an advantage over everybody else that it doesn't matter what other advantage you have. Whoever develops AI in this manner first will win overall. And so that is why you see so many countries investing so much in AI. And he also talked about nuclear weapons. And here's the thing, people have to understand, if there were a war between the US and China, especially China would want to mitigate it as much as possible, just like we see Russia and even Iran. Russia currently in a proxy war against all of NATO. Iran, a temporary pause in the fighting, I guess you could say. But they do not want to continue fighting. If they could have any option to get out of fighting, they will, because they understand they're at the disadvantage. The U.S. is on the other side of the planet trying to destroy their country. Iran really has no way of striking back at the U.S. And even though China has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can strike the U.S., to use them would invite a retaliation by the U.S. China does not have the ability to disable U.S. nuclear deterrence. So they do not want it to escalate to that level. So when people talk about the U.S. using nuclear weapons in a conflict, localized, say, over Taiwan, and people think, well, that's not possible because China will just retaliate. They might not retaliate. And this is what the U.S. counts on. This was the madman theory I think Carl brought up earlier. You're a psychopath running around covered in blood with a knife, and people don't really know what to do with you. And this is how the U.S. is operating. Now, the U.S. Air Force exercises in the Pacific, to get to your question, Danny, sorry to be so long-winded, they are practicing a concept known as agile combat employment. And as KJ said, shoot and scoot. This is something artillery units do. They fire a barrage, and then they know that the counter battery radar of the enemy can see where those rounds came from. So they have to pack everything up and move before the enemy starts firing back at their positions. The U.S. is doing this with their entire Air Force across the Asia-Pacific region. As KJ said, they're looking for every piece of asphalt to weaponize, to turn into air bases, networks and networks of air bases. They can move their planes around, disperse their forces, move from one place to the other, to constantly be moving, to force China to use larger and larger quantities of missiles to try to target and destroy and keep these bases knocked out. And so that's what they're practicing right now. Now, even though this is happening under the Trump administration, and it fits in so perfectly with Trump's policy of confronting and encircling, containing China. But in actuality, this was all developed under the Biden administration. The whole U.S. Marine Corps was reorganized to fight China under the Biden administration. And now, surprise, it's all the pieces are in place for President Trump to now put these pieces in use. When I say continuity of agenda, I'm talking about there is only one single foreign policy, and all you get when you vote in a new president or new members of Congress are different faces telling you sometimes different lies about why nothing is actually changing, making excuses for why we have to do this thing that the Biden administration was doing, even though I said I was going to do the exact opposite of everything the Biden administration did. So it is continuity of agenda. The U.S. wants war with China. People have to understand there's something very deeply rooted here. It is a non-white nation that is surpassing not just the U.S., but all of Western civilization. And to the people who currently run the collective West, coming from generations and generations of racist imperial conquerors, this is unacceptable. This is something they will not accept. And because they are going to be the very, very last people to pay the price for their own actions, they're going to continue pushing this in an extreme direction. Absolutely everyone else on Earth will pay for before they do. And this is what's so dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this case, all points here are true. And I think that's what is, I think, very difficult for some to understand, is that there's both this, if an empire is having difficulty conquering, if it is having difficulty achieving what it sets out to do, then it will go to even more extreme measures in order to get that, which is why people should definitely be paying attention to the nuclear question. Now, I wanted to maybe end this program, and we can begin back to you, Carl, with, when we're talking about this empire, the U.S. empire in decline, one of the really, I think, big examples of this is what's happening still with Yemen. So Yemen, Ansar Allah, the Houthis as they are called, they are causing a lot of trouble even still. They are targeting vessels through the Red Sea. That blockade is still going on. The Eternity Sea cargo ship was sunk. 3 people were killed. This is a merchant, a Greek-owned Liberia. Essentially, though, it is seen as an Israeli vessel because it's doing economic activity for and with Israel. But, I'm just going to play this in the background as you comment on this. This is one of the ways, Carl, it seems that the United States can't conquer anymore. So it has to, and there are reports that the U.S. is gearing up potentially soon for another strike on Yemen. But I think this is reflective of a bigger problem for the United States. And I'm curious on your take on this.
Well, I mean, U.S. failed the first time trying to bomb Yemen into submission. U.S. have been involved in wars against Yemen since 2014. It's more than a decade, and the Yemeni people haven't bowed. The renewed aggression against Yemen will make no difference. And in fact, during the first operation against Yemen, the U.S. admiral says this was the most intense naval engagement that U.S. Navy has engaged in since World War II. Well, guess what? They lost 3 F-18s against a country with no air force and no air defense. This shows the real limitations on the U.S. empire. They can't do that against Yemen. There's less they could do about Iran, and this is why they have all these crazy plans of using tactical nukes against China. But look, China is not defenseless. China has nukes. China's nuclear arsenal is expanding. And using tactical nukes in battle is just going to open a Pandora's box. It's going to open up precedents. Yes, China may not. The hope of U.S. Pentagon planner was that, okay, maybe using tactical nuke that will fall under the threshold of using strategic nuke. So the hope is China will not respond by launching ICBM against Los Angeles. But look, if U.S. can use tactical nukes, that means China can also use tactical nukes. And right now, China has developed a complete kill chain with their satellites detecting all the U.S. surface fleet movement, and including all the U.S. bases in the Western Pacific. And guess what? All of them are within range of Chinese missiles based in China. Now the Chinese have the capability to track a U.S. Navy ship in its movement in the Pacific and then send a anti-ship ballistic missile against it, and then based on the satellite feedback to correct the course of the ballistic missile so you will strike the target. So none of the U.S. surface fleet it will be safe if a war kicks off. And if U.S. can use tactical nukes against, say, a Chinese naval base, that means China can use tactical nukes against U.S. aircraft carrier groups. This is not the China is building up its own capability, and as time goes on, China's capability will only grow stronger. And right now, U.S. I know U.S. is trying to provoke a conflict, but China is not taking bait. U.S. has sent more than 500 Marines to Taiwan already, but you know what? China, look, okay. What's those 500 Marines gonna do? If when shit hits the fan and China put on blockade, those 500 Marines will be just sitting ducks. And this is why China is not it's not taking the bait of U.S. trying to bait China into a larger conflict, because China knows time is on its side. By 2030, China will be in a much more stronger position when Chinese 6th generation aircraft take into the sky and there's no U.S. 6th generation aircraft on the scene. So, I still remain optimistic. I know U.S. can be crazy. They're projecting this madman image of themselves to force the other side to calm down. But you know what? Two can play this game.
KJ, come on.
To strike a balance, on the one hand, I do believe the threat of war is very real. I see the momentum for it. I've been tracking it for over 12 years. I've been watching everything that's happening, and this momentum is continually building. You see the heightened information warfare, you see the staging of the theater for war, the preparation, and then you see the constant escalating provocation. These are all very, very bad signs. And of course, we know that, the US is a failing capitalist empire, and the reset button for capitalism is always war. You destroy everything and you reset everything, and now you can start again. You don't have to worry about the overproduction and the underconsumption, etc. So this has traditionally been the method that is being used. The thing that we might be able to hope for is that Trump at core, and again, this depends on how much influence he has, is he is a warmonger, but he doesn't like losing wars. So if he can be convinced to understand that this is a war that there is no way he can win, then he might be able to rein back Elbridge Colby and some of the other hawks. So it's a possibility. I put that out there, but I actually have no insight into what will really happen. I think the thing that we have to understand is that war functions as a continuum, and it's a hybrid war, and it comes in multi-domains. And the domain that is primary, and which the US has tremendous superiority still to this day, is in information warfare. It is 100 years of advertising and PR has made it so that it is extraordinarily skilled in information warfare. And the military quite literally sees your mind as a battlefield. Your mind itself is seen as a territory of contestation. And so that means that we can start out by starting to resist that indoctrination which is leading us to war, which is convincing us that war is necessary and inevitable, and that China is a threat. Of course, China is no such thing. It's not a threat. What they mean by threat is that China is uppity, that it is not in its place, and that it dared to rise and challenge the white Western imperial powers. Not only did it dare to rise, challenge, and develop itself, but it did this by using socialism, which is not supposed to work. Socialism is supposed to collapse of its own contradictions. How dare they use this damnable socialism to develop their country and to make it even better and more developed than ours. So there's so many contradictions. There's so many ancient hatreds that are being stoked, that are very, very easy to manipulate in the general public. So I think the first line of defense is you kind of have to degauss your brain of all this indoctrination and hate mongering and manufacturing of consent for war. And the more absurd the lies you're being told, that the closer we are to war. Those who tell you absurdities are preparing you for atrocities. So we have to resist falling into that indoctrination. And then we have to speak out, both as individuals and as, in solidarity with large groups, and to speak out against this escalation to war, to inform ourselves, and then to speak out, and then to take whatever, civil action is necessary to prevent this escalation.
Yeah, Brian, weigh in.
Well, I agree with Carl and KJ. I agree with Carl in the sense that China knows that time is on their side. Iran knows that time is on their side. Russia knows that time is on their side. They all understand this. And this is why the US is doing increasingly unhinged things to provoke conflict on its terms and force these nations into wars sooner rather than later. That was the whole point of destabilizing, capturing, and weaponizing Ukraine. It was to force Russia to act when in reality they had no desire to ever go into Ukraine. They forced them to do it, and they are forcing Iran to fight this war of self-preservation in the Middle East, and they continuously try to provoke China. And of course, as Carl pointed out, These nations are not sitting on their hands while the U.S. does this. They are constantly adapting and overcoming U.S. provocations, attempts to undermine them. I would say the real weak point, and this coincides with KJ's point, is information war, multi-domain warfare that is taking place outside the traditional realms of national security. So I always talk about information space and how important this is as a national security domain, as your land borders, your shores, and your airspace. And if you're not protecting your information space in the same manner as all of these other physical domains, then you're not actually protecting your country. And I live in Southeast Asia. It's not just Thailand. Many nations in this region fail categorically to defend their information space. It is overrun. The US does as it pleases in this information space. And it undermines the formidable military power that many of these nations have. Thailand has a pretty powerful military. They work very closely with China. They replaced all their main battle tanks, American-made battle tanks, with Chinese-made battle tanks. They have joint weapon programs, basically an equivalent to the HIMARS that they have developed with China, and also combat drones. The problem is, if the US is inside your country infecting and overrunning your information space, as KJ says, this is the battlefield for people's minds. If you turn these people against their own best interests, like the US has successfully done in places like Ukraine or the island province of Taiwan or all across the Philippines, it doesn't matter how powerful your military is, you have nobody willing to get in those tanks, fly those aircraft, or point those weapons in the right direction. And this is something the US still excels at. And this is something the multipolar world is still falling far behind in regards to. This is something that desperately needs to be addressed. So, I think time is on China's side, which is why people say, why doesn't China do this? Why don't they do that? Why doesn't Russia and Iran do these things? I think it's one part, they're not all powerful and they can't do certain things. And then on the other hand, things that they could do, they don't feel that it's actually necessary, not at this juncture. And so there's a lot to balance against each other. It's not simple. It's not contained in any one of these conflicts. It is a global conflict being fought across multiple domains. And we have to look at each one and consider them before drawing conclusions about any one specific area.
Yeah, and with China gets a lot of criticisms for the Great Firewall. It gets a lot of criticisms for its deep commitment to develop its own indigenous, domestic, technological sector. But and again, it's often blamed and said to be stealing things that the United States doesn't even have. But it's this strength of China and China's economy and its ability to create its own information space that helps protect it from the very things that you're talking about, Brian, which is why, this is one of the big advantages that I think I'm sure everyone in every country in the multipolar world under threat right now is taking deep notes on. But I wanted to go through some audience questions. There's only a few. And then, we can kind of close on this. And as you're answering them, whoever wants to answer a question, you can take it. Here is the first one. It's a good one. We didn't cover this today. Do you have any more information about the the story of China targeting a German gunship in the Red Sea with a laser? That was what I was seeing in the headlines. Whoever wants to go. KJ, how about you? I know that you've been covering this.
Well, we don't have a lot of good information yet. A lot of it is just kind of like, propaganda coming out of the Western press. But I think we need to ask a couple of questions. Why is German AWACS in the Red Sea? And also, why is it getting close to a Chinese warship? The Chinese warship clearly has a reason to be there. It is, listening and sending a message of presence. But if you get that close where you can actually be hit with a laser, that means you've already come within visual distance, which is a very, very provocative and I think, triggering thing to do. If I read some of the Western press, they're saying that China fired a laser at this German ship and a German plane,
Like
and
Star
they had,
Trek.
like Star Trek, and they had to hightail it out of that before the entire cockpit exploded in flames. No, I don't think that's what happened. If it did happen, it was probably some kind of a targeting laser. Sent a laser beam, and that sends the message that you are being tracked and you are potentially being targeted. And so, having received that message, I think the Germans turned tail, went back to their barracks, and then did some intensive trauma therapy because they were clearly panicking and hyperventilating. But I think they're trying to make of it much more than what it actually is, which is probably an aggressive maneuver by the Germans, and then they realized that the Chinese were not to be trifled with. I think that's probably what it has happened. But I think we have to place it in the context of, for example, Mark Rutte saying that, China will ask Russia to attack NATO when it is going to attack Taiwan. So it's this kind of globalization of conflict and this kind of NATO triggering or provocation of war against China. I think that's a part of the scenario.
If anyone has another comment on this, feel free. There's a few more, but if there's anyone that wants to take this, perhaps Brian, aren't most Patriot missiles the shoot down a lame airplane kind? Seems only 10% of them are anti-missile. They're ineffective. What's your take on this?
Well, there are different versions of the Patriot missile interceptor. I'm not actually exactly sure about that specific aspect of it, but even if every single one of them was an anti-ballistic missile, that could, with 100% accuracy, shoot down ballistic missiles, the U.S. still would not have nearly as enough of them just for their conflict in Ukraine, saying nothing of waging any sort of protracted conflict against Iran, and especially no conceivable long-term conflict with China. So this is a huge problem. They produce only 500, maybe 550 to 600 a year, and by 2027 they're going to expand it to a whopping 650 a year. Russia is already making 700, 800 Iskander missiles alone, saying nothing of Kinzhal and all the cruise missiles and everything else that the Patriot would also be used to attempt to intercept.
Anyone else want to comment on this one? And then there's actually one specifically for Brian, but maybe, well, Carl, you can answer, I guess, from the Bali perspective. I guess Steve McNally, with a very generous super chat, said, visited Bangkok in the last year to attend a mate's fight. I have no intention of going back because of the state of workers' accommodation clearly visible on the way in from the airport. Is this typical in Thailand? So I guess Thailand, Carl, you can also answer to this, but maybe Carl, you first, since it's for Brian. But
that's Brian's neighborhood.
Well, look, if you travel around Thailand, there's many different kinds of construction taking place, being done by many different types of people. If you have people who have come in from, say, Myanmar, they are working in these basically like shanties that are on site. They have basic amenities, I guess you would say. They have toilets and showers and everything. And then, especially if you're in the city, you have 7-Eleven and everything around that you could go buy whatever you need, or local markets where you could buy everything that you need. So, I mean, it is what it is. I don't know what kind of accommodations you would expect those type of workers to be. Yeah, go ahead.
I will put in my 2 cents as a visitor to Bangkok, because I was just recently there where I met with Brian. For me, I have a totally different perspective, because I went to Thailand in 2002, right after 9/11. I was in Thailand. I went to Bangkok. Back then, Bangkok was like a movie set out of those Vietnam War movies, right? I mean, like I saw like rats running around the street downtown, and I saw elephant on the street. Like 2 o'clock in the morning, I went downstairs to a 7-Eleven to buy some snack. I literally saw an elephant walking down the street of This is Bangkok, right, capital of Thailand. And I came back recently, and I was pleasantly surprised. I was actually very impressed by the transformation that took place in the last 22 years. It's quite striking. You know, like the Thailand is it's nice. They have nice infrastructure. They have very nice, clean metro system. You know, even with protective rails, so nobody can throw people onto the tracks. And people lined up. Thai people are super polite. So I had a great time. You know, I went to the mall. They're just like malls everywhere else. You know, no different. And there was like a group of teenage girl there gathering to watch boys band. Right? I mean, like this is just normal. There's a large consumer society that's been developing in Thailand. This is This is obviously evidence of growing middle class. So I think that I think it's because I have that contrast. I know what Thailand was 20 years ago, and I see Thailand today. I see the improvement. Maybe the person come from an experience where he, I don't know where any other countries he has been outside the United States, and he, Bangkok is not Minnesota, okay? Let's put that way. But Thailand is not Minnesota, right? It's still a emerging economy. It's still trying to develop. So of course, it's not, if you compare to the U.S. standards, maybe that's not up to par. But for their own country's development trajectory, Thailand already made tremendous strides in the last 20 years. I quite like Bangkok. I wouldn't mind moving there. Well, I can because I love surfing, and Bali is perfect for that. But if that was not a consideration, I wouldn't have mind to move to Bangkok. Everything is very convenient. People are polite. It's safe. And it's and many places are clean, much cleaner than U.S. city, which is much more than you can say about places like New York or San Francisco. So that's my 5 cents.
Well, I just about the construction, you're going to find construction sites like that. Other construction workers are bussed in or brought in on trucks, and they live in apartments that at one point, when I first came over here, I had no skill set. I had nothing, and I was living in apartments with people who did work like that. And it's very basic, but it's comfortable. It has absolutely everything you need. So, you see one thing on your way to one event, and then you generalize about an entire country of 70 million people. I don't think that's a fair way to pass judgment on an entire country. You really need to look into it instead of, I saw some people in like tin shacks on a construction site, and then think that every single construction site looks like that. It's not true. And a lot of these people are people who came in from Myanmar, and they've chosen to do that. There's a misconception that here people are so desperate for work and money. There are so many opportunities to advance yourself. You can go to university in Bangkok, and you could get a degree for like $1 per credit. It's just something inconceivable. If you lived in the United States, wouldn't be possible. And I know people who come from poor families. They share an apartment, they go through university, and then they get decent jobs. And like Carl says, they join this growing middle class. So you gotta be careful about generalizing based on one short trip.
Yeah, I actually am going to make a general statement. I know nothing about Thailand, but I do want to make the general statement that, as a general rule, migrant labor around the world is really exploited, badly treated. I knew a friend who worked as a foreman of migrant laborers, Koreans who went to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. They were building, construction, and he said that they were forced to work while they were being bombed. So I think that gives you a sense of, how they're treated. And of course, even in the United States, the way that immigrants are treated is atrocious. I knew, somebody I knew, was working on a construction site. He told his boss that the scaffolding was not safe. And the guy said, "I don't care, you go up there anyway." And the scaffolding collapsed. He fell down 3 stories. And then once he was on the ground and injured, they just told him to get lost. So these kinds of abuses happen all around the world. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of. The whole notion of an illegal immigrant in the United States was created at the end of slavery, because they needed a whole new set of workers who had no rights and no capacity to demand, fair treatment.
Yeah, well, no doubt. Well, Thailand, I've never been there, don't know much about it, so I defer to you, Carl and Brian. But Thailand it's an emerging economy. It's a developing country. It's one that has poverty, and I think that one of the key things here is that it's projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which are going to offer the future for a real future for the developing countries, for the global south, which can potentially build the blocks toward addressing all of the problems that the underdeveloped world, the formerly colonized world, however people want to, the global south, however people want to characterize it, all of these major problems that really do fall at the feet of this historic long process of Western imperial domination and subjugation. I mean, that's really the root problem here. And so it's great to hear that Thailand is able to and is developing at a rapid rate. And I think that this is the pattern for Asia as a whole. And this is why Asia, especially East Asia and the Pacific, will turn to China and is already turning to China away from whatever the United States is trying to make it do, especially on the economic front. These tariffs are only going to make it worse. Anything you gentlemen want to say before we head out of here?
I just want to add something to what KJ said, because I agree. And I think migrant workers, wherever they go, they're desperate, and people will make use of that desperation. In Thailand, you will see the workers from Myanmar, they do get access to healthcare. They're obviously not living as comfortable as Thai people. It's just a fact. But it has been improving over the years. But one thing I want to add, the whole reason you have people flooding in from Myanmar is because the U.S. has waged a multi-decade proxy war against the central government in Myanmar. They're trying to overthrow the government, install a client regime. Look at a map. Myanmar is right on the border with China, and it is a Belt and Road Initiative partner. There are pipelines that go through Myanmar that help move hydrocarbons to China, so that Chinese tankers don't have to go through the Strait of Malacca and of course through the South China Sea. Choke points the U.S. has designated that they will try to close in any sort of conflict with China. So, again, you could blame. I guess you could blame certain people in Thailand are working to fix it. Other people are taking advantage of it. But ultimately, these people would be living happy, comfortable lives in Myanmar, just like Thai people live comfortable lives here, if that war wasn't going on for decades and the U.S. wasn't fueling it.
I agree with Brian. And I think, Danny, you've made the really, really good point, is if we pan out and we look at the big picture, if we see the kind of development and the infrastructural development and the kind of global lifting up of all, the global South countries that China is initiating through its Belt and Road and BRICS projects, I think that is salutary. So certainly the global South is still suffering. I grew up in a Korea which, was rapidly industrializing. It's still suffering a lot. The current president of South Korea was a former factory worker, and he will tell you that, when he was working in a factory, he was beaten black and blue, as a child from the age of 12. So the conditions of labor in the global South are, really, really bad. But as it develops, as it gets better, and as it follows the lead of China, which has lifted up, living standards for everybody, all of its workers, then I think there's hope and optimism for the rest of the world. And this is exactly what the US wants to prevent. It wants to keep everybody down under their heel in this kind of global hierarchy where they're at the top and exploiting everybody else to the max.
Is it any wonder why Donald Trump and the Trump administration is so afraid of BRICS? And this is the big reason why, is that they want exactly what you just said, KJ. They do not want to see BRICS grow. It doesn't matter how idiotic Trump is. He thinks Spain is in BRICS. He thinks BRICS was created to essentially F the US in the A, essentially, but that's not the case. It doesn't matter.
And he thinks BRICS is dying. He thinks BRICS is falling apart.
It's dying, but it's got to be tariffed. But it's trying to de-dollarize. It's made against the US. But the point is that's the big point, is that it's all about subjugating the rest of the world.
I just want to add, I have traveled to Thailand, Malaysia. I'm in Indonesia. I see development everywhere, and I see a lot of Chinese investment into the region, a lot of infrastructure building. So it's very obvious that Southeast Asia has chosen. And I in the contrast, I just don't see the equivalent of kind of U.S. investment into this region in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of building up the economy. Like the Asians have already moved on. This is an Asian century. We are already in it. There's development all around us, and this is why I remain broadly optimistic for the future.
Well, this was a great conversation. Everybody, make sure you hit the like button before you go. That helps keep the stream going in YouTube's algorithm. I want to point you all to the video description, because I have put in there Brian's YouTube channel, Carl's YouTube channel, and also the link where you can find KJ Noh's work at the China Report. Anything else that you guys want to plug before we head out of here?
I just want to say thank you, Danny, for having me on. It's always an honor to share the screen with Danny and Carl, and I'm very happy to have finally shared the screen with KJ. I've been following your work recently, and it's very excellent.
Thank you. Feel the same, and great honor to be with everybody.
Of course.
Yeah, but people feel free to check out my YouTube channel. I have my own channel, Carl Zha, and I'm also a prolific shit poster on Twitter. If you want some entertainment, you can follow me there. My account is also Carl Zha, and if you want to support my surfing lifestyle in Bali, go subscribe to my Patreon. Look for Silk and Steel podcast.
Right.
Talk about everything China, but I'm currently doing a chronological retelling of the Chinese history. I'm currently at 344 BC. So. That is going to be a project, Carl. So hey, that's why everyone should support you. I plan to live a long time.
Yeah.
I'm taking my time. China's on my side.
China's government's always saying 5,000 years of history. Yes, Carl, you will have to use many days, weeks, and months to cram that in. So everyone, yes, video description. You can find Carl's YouTube channel and all the places, I'm sure, where you can support him. Hit the like button. In the video description is all the places you can support this channel: Patreon, Substack, Buy Me a Coffee, and so many other options. With that said, everybody, I'll be back again soon. Take care and have a good night, morning, wherever you are.